van Heukelom. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite, and I welcome you today to a special webinar. This is our virtual launch of the ASRS, the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standard Readiness Assessment. Today we're going to take you through what that exactly is, what is that readiness assessment, and we'll also talk a little bit about what the ASRS are. So we'll take you through how to prepare for Australia's mandatory climate disclosures. Before I introduce our special guest today, I want to spend just a little bit of time on who Socialsuite is. We're a software company working on simple and affordable sustainability and impact solutions. We've been working with over 100 publicly traded companies across the US, Canada, of course in Australia and New Zealand as well, and a lot of not-for-profits as well, working on their social impact and help them report that. Before I do introductions of who we are and what we're going to do today, run to the agenda, a little bit of housekeeping here. We'll take about 30 minutes to run you through this webinar, and after that we'll leave a little bit of time for a question and answer session. I already recommend that once you have something that you do want to ask us, don't wait for the Q&A, put it in the chat, which is on the right-hand side here, that you can see it's a public chat there. Put in the chat any questions you have. We might pick them up while we go through the content of the webinar. Otherwise, we'll leave them to the end and see if we can get to answering all your questions there. With that, it's a great pleasure to welcome here today Ilona Marchetta. Ilona, maybe you can give us a little bit of your background and expertise around sustainability and your change management, the work that you do.
Sure, thanks, Tim. So I am one of the few people to hold certifications across both GRI and ISSB, with ISSB being the standards that the Australian standards are being modelled on. And I am also an experienced change manager, having worked across huge pieces of reform at Westpac and also QBE, where I was the sole change manager working on the net zero in underwriting program. So that's the lens that I bring to the webinar and the readiness assessment.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Ilona. And clearly we have the right person in the room here today. So what we've done is we've created a ASRS Readiness Assessment. And Ilona and I worked on that to really kind of create something that helps people understand how ready they are for the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. Now, your question might be, what exactly is that? So that's the first part of the webinar. We are not going to spend too much time on that because there's a lot of information already out there on the ASRS. It's still, I think the bill's still with Parliament, so we're still waiting on the final details around that. But at large, the standards are available. You can go through that. We've done that, of course. We've distilled out of that a readiness assessment. So that's the main content for today. Is we'll walk you through that. What does that look like? What are the key questions we ask you? Why do we ask them? How do you fill out that readiness assessment? And then what do you learn from that? You get your readiness score. What does that mean? And what are the follow-up actions you can take? That is that next section, the actions you can take, how can you move forward, what can you do, and then we'll link all that back to a Q&A in which we'll address any questions you have in relation to this webinar, to the ASRS, the readiness assessment, and we'll share, of course, throughout the webinar, nearing the end of our presentation, the link where you can find the readiness assessment. We've already had some pre-questions there. How long does it take, and is it free? It is a free assessment, and it will only take you 10 to 15 minutes to complete that. So it's definitely something that I would say stick around to the end of the webinar to get to the link. So the first part then is we're going to spend a few minutes only on the ASRS and walk you through what it is and what that means. So the first thing I'll do is I'll jump over and ask Ilona a few questions around this in a minute. But the first thing is setting that scene a little bit. Why are we here today? Now, the Australian government, a few years back, really kind of committed itself to introducing internationally aligned mandatory climate-related financial reporting. And the key thing is that at large in the ESG, sustainability and climate space, we've seen that there have been a lot of voluntary frameworks, standards and approaches already. Particularly larger companies have done a lot of voluntary reporting, particularly on climate-related financial disclosures, but now we're moving to more of a mandatory regime there. The reason for that is that the Australian government said it's really important for Australians at large, and in particular for investors, to have greater transparency and more comparable information. Because the main thing is, if you have voluntary reporting, everyone does it in a slightly different way. Once you set the rules that are exactly the same for everyone, you get a lot more comparability, you get a lot more participants in there because everyone needs to do it. And with that, we can better understand for our Australian companies what their exposure is to climate-related financial risks and opportunities. But with that as well, climate-related plans, strategies, how are businesses at large dealing with climate? So in order to get that moving forward, it tasked the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB, with delivering, and that's where we get to it, the ASRS, the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards. They introduce a standardized climate reporting regime, particular requirements for Australia, but all of that is not brand new. It is modeled off, you might have heard of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has been absorbed and kind of the groundwork for what the ISSB has done in their IFRS S2 standard on climate-related disclosures. So the Australian work here, as Ilona already flagged in her introduction there, is really heavily based on the work of the ISSB. It is aligned with a lot of the international reporting. The only thing that the Australian regime does is it's really clearly laser focused on climate. Before I move on from there, Ilona, any thoughts from you on this?
No, maybe just to call out just a couple of things that you said there is that this is financial materiality. So for people who are already reporting and they're reporting impacts and financial materiality, or reporting one or the other, this is financial materiality. And that's not to say that the work that you might have done to uncover your impacts won't feed into this, but the key focus is financial materiality.
I think that's a really key component to keep in mind while we go through all of this. Yeah. Now with that, I think the key thing here is, I don't want to go in too much detail, but we've been on a journey here. The TCFD, a voluntary framework, was introduced in 2017. A lot of companies have already reported on that. And the main point here is that we're moving towards that mandatory reporting regime there. So that's the key thing to keep in mind here. Voluntary reporting is now becoming mandatory reporting, and we're really focusing on those climate-related financial disclosures. So who does this apply to? And maybe I'll just jump back to you, Ilona, here. If you're an organization listening to this webinar, should you, are you automatically any organization, or how have they framed that up?
So there are thresholds which we've got up here, and there's a 3-phased rollout. And what we have here is the final phase of the rollout. So anyone above this, you are in the thresholds. But if you're below this, that's not to say that you won't be impacted by the ASRS. It is highly likely that you will be impacted because you will fall into the value chain of anyone who is mandated to report. And so it's important that you are aware of what's in the standards, because it is likely that you will be asked some of these questions by someone that you have a business relationship with, your suppliers. So it's probably a good idea to have a look at your own value chain and have a think about where people in your value chain might sit when you think about these thresholds.
And I think that is the key point here, is that a lot of organizations will be directly kind of affected by the legislation and have to do the work. If you just don't meet that threshold here for applicability, that means you're not fully kind of scot-free there. You often get in your value chain, companies coming back to you to collect data for themselves to report, and they'll ask you all these questions. So you'll need to be able to answer those climate-related questions there. So at large, if you really simplified kind of look at it and generalize a little bit, everyone will be in some shape or form be affected by this legislation. So keep that in mind. Another key component here, and I think this is good in reflection, again, we flagged that a little bit already, is that this voluntary framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is really provided the framework for a lot of the voluntary and now mandatory regulation and standards and frameworks for reported on climate-related financial disclosures. They've done that in 4 sections: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And I just want to bring that up because some of your organizations that are watching this webinar might already be very familiar with this, so that helps. If not, then again, you'll see that this structure comes back everywhere. So this is a very common structure to keep in mind, that those kind of 4 areas will resonate through a lot of the work that we're going to go through. Now, the core then, how does that readiness assessment, how does that build up? What does it do? How does it work? And how can it help you? So the first part here is the Australian government has put out what they called an exposure draft, 103 pages in October 2023, which includes, there are 2 standards, ASRS 1 and 2, and a third kind of, one-on-one with some reference material, particular for the Australian market there. But the key here is that it's a lot of material, a lot of pages, and we understand that a lot of companies either haven't had the time or the resources yet to go fully through that and fully understand what that means. So that is why we said, let's see if we can make a quick and simple tool to help companies understand what are those climate-related disclosure requirements that are in the ASRS, and help them determine where they are in that journey, what do they already have, where are they in that level of preparedness to respond to what is required under the ASRS. So all that, Ilona and I have tried to put into a survey, the readiness assessment that will give you, in 10 minutes, a range of questions that we'll look at in detail over the next few slides. And that will be scored and weighted, and that will then give you a readiness score. Now, this is just a way in which we really hope to give you some idea at a high level where you are and how much work and which potential components you still need to do to get ready. Oh, let's jump to the first one. So this is the start of that readiness assessment here. Initially, we're just asking for some standardized business information, and that's just your business details, contact details. Now, this is quite important to get this right, because what we're aiming to do as well is to really build up a view of the market in Australia. How well prepared are different industries, different segments in terms of smaller versus larger companies? So the more information you can give us here about what industry you're in, your number of employees, the better we can then later feed that information back to you. When we've had a number of responses, and we can really kind of filter that and say, in your industry or based on your profile, this is where the market's at. You're kind of ahead of the pack, or you're with the majority of people in the starting phase of that climate journey. So this is pretty straightforward information, but it helps, I think, us and indirectly you a lot if you fill that out. Then I will jump back to you, Ilona. Our first real page of questions here. These questions are more on organizational preparedness. So this is a range of general and business model questions there. What is the reasoning behind this set of questions?
Yeah, that's right. So most of these questions, I think none of these questions are actually directly related to questions that are in the ASRS. However, from an on-the-ground change management point of view, they relate to things you'll need to think about from a resourcing point of view, a capacity point of view. So they start to get you thinking about, do we have the right people? Do we have the right teams in place to be managing and reporting for ASRS? So that's where we've got some questions in there about communications. If you don't have a communications functions or team, I would be suggesting that you start to think about that. There is a lot of stakeholder engagement, which I think we're going to have a look at on the next page. So that's the idea of these questions here.
And I think that's really important as well, to really realize that it's just not answering the specific data point there. It is really about your organizational capacity to drive some of this reporting and change that's required, embed some of the work to make sure it doesn't become tick box exercise, but really kind of embed the work within your organization. And you'll need some capacity to be able to do that. So this gives us a good view of where you are. In particular, on business model there, I think that's a good introduction to your point around stakeholder engagement. We're asking about have you mapped and do you understand your business activities across your entire value chain? So value chain is like the key thing that stands out here and links to that next section on stakeholders, where you see it comes up again. Going into value chain, stakeholders in a bit more detail, why is that so important?
Yeah, and just coming back to, so value chain, the business model question there is the only one that is really directly linked to ASRS. It is a requirement. If you don't do that, you're going to really struggle with everything else. It's the foundational activity. And one of the key differences between ASRS and maybe potentially for those who are starting to become familiar with the European standards or the CSRD is stakeholder engagement. So for the Australian standards, stakeholder engagement is not mandatory. It is not required. There are no direct questions about this. However, as part of your risk assessment process, you will find that to undertake due diligence, you will need to engage your stakeholders at some point. So it is important, and it is a requirement for your foundational activities that when you map your value chain, you do think about who are our stakeholders across that value chain. And that's not just your suppliers, that would also be your customers, potentially some community groups. So you really do have to think about it end to end, and how you might go about engaging those stakeholders. And stakeholders, changes in your value chain are also a trigger for needing to do this assessment again. And so that's why it's important that you think about how will we maintain this ongoing dialogue with our stakeholders.
I think there's a few key things I really think kind of you really kind of pin down really well, is that the value chain is really foundational. If you don't understand your value chain, then it's really hard to do all the rest of the work required to report on the ASRS. So in your value chain, the other point you made really important is it's more than just your supply chain. And people sometimes use that interchangeably, supply chain, value chain, but supply chain is only one part of it. Your value chain includes that upstream, that supply, your core operations, your downstream, so your customers, and the end of life of your products and services. So it's that whole kind of range from start to finish, everything in there. And related to all that, what are your stakeholders, your business relationships? So all these components are important to understand to provide that groundwork for what you'll need to do a bit later. We'll get to that into a minute. But if you don't do that, and that initial foundational piece of work, the rest will become increasingly difficult. So the next component, and that is, we've looked at those 4 key components or pillars of TCFD. Governance is one of the key ones there that TCFD starts with. So this is a really important set of questions as well, really asking around responsibility for overseeing climate-related risk and opportunities and how you embed that in your organization, as well as management role on that. Why is this component so important, Ilona?
It's really important because I think we've got to remember as well that with the standards, the standards they're not subjective. They don't say whether something is right or wrong to have. It's asking you to disclose. But then it becomes quite obvious to the reader whether there is governance in place and what that governance looks like. So that's why it's really important to be thinking about these things. And it is becoming more and more standardized, expected that there will be a sustainability function, and that sustainability, ESG, climate change, has been integrated into your governance framework. It's just becoming expected way of doing business, really.
And I think the benefit of that is what we now see in some organizations is that sustainability or climate are a bit of lone ranger functions, where there's one person tasked with that, and some organizations, then management and the board, the governance function and the leadership function don't really kind of fully appreciate the importance of that function and don't really have particular insights or particular oversight of that function. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. They tick the box that something's being done. And this is really driving that. Are you fully embedding this? Are you fully making sure that your governance function is across whatever is happening around climate, around sustainability? So it's making sure it's a whole of organization approach, and that at every level, you're really, having that oversight and that, embedding it in the, business as usual. So I think it's a key component here. And another really important point I think you made there is that at large, these questions are all about disclosure. Where are you? There's no value judgment if you don't have it, that it's terrible, or it's more like it's about understanding where you are. And that's the step. But implicitly, that means if you answer no to everything, your stakeholders reading your report and your disclosures will make up their mind based on the information you've provided. So there is a, implicit requirement to do this work, but directly out of the disclosure requirements, just like tell us where you are.
Yeah.
With that governance, let's jump onto strategy then as the next pillar there of work there. And I think we've addressed a little bit of that, but the main thing here, we spoke about that value chain, and we see that come back here. Where that first question, 28, is really looking at, have you already assessed each component of your value chain for climate-related physical and transition risks and opportunities? Now, TCFD has really laid that out. There's a lot of detail and guidance on how to do that. And now the question is, have you gone into that? Why is this, again, such an important component?
Yeah, and just on that, you called out TCFD. We've directly called it out here, and that's one of the key differences when we think about climate-related financial disclosures compared to other sustainability ESG topics is for risks and opportunities. The TCFD has actually given us a list of risks and opportunities to look at. It's a great starting point, which is unlike a lot of other topics in ESG, where the companies are kind of really got to think about it and come up to that list from scratch, essentially. So you've got a starting point there, and what we're really looking for in strategy, or what the standards are really looking for, is that linkage between the risks and opportunities and how this is impacting finances, how it could impact your finances. So this is where we're starting to get a bit circular in. We've identified a risk and opportunity. We've identified that it's got a financial impact. Now, how are we managing that impact? That's essentially what these questions are asking.
And I think that's the key there. It's like, where do they sit in the value chain? How do they impact your business? What is the financial implication from that? And then how are you dealing? And I think that's what question 30 then comes into. Like, once you understand that, are you actually, making any changes to your business in terms of your strategy, your policies, your decisions? So the key here is understanding if you, again, do it as a tick box exercise and it sits somewhere on the shelf, or you're actually taking what you've done there, the findings, and making that work for your business and implementing that. 31, scenario analysis, a bit more of an advanced field. Would you agree with me on that? And what would that really kind of entail for most companies?
Yeah, and I think great call out, because with scenario analysis, it's okay to be iterative about this. If this is the first time you've tackled TCFD, it's the first time you're actually really tackling all of the content that the standards ask of you. Scenario analysis is a are you using it? How are you using it? And I would say that there wouldn't necessarily be an expectation that you are using it just yet. It's very early stages of development using scenario analysis for climate risk modeling. So it's okay to be iterative. It's okay to just be starting to think about how you might apply that. So I guess I want to provide, a little bit of reassurance and relief there potentially that it's a really big beast, and it's okay to start small, start with one area of your value chain, start with the areas of greatest risk.
Yeah. And that links really neatly to the next section there, risk management. To be able to do that, you need to understand then, out of all those climate-related risks you have identified, which are the highest priority ones. So really that prioritization of risk is really important, because it enables you to have a laser focus on what are the key areas to work on. And with that, I think as well, question 33 is about, you've done this exercise now, how are you actually managing your climate-related risk? You've prioritized them maybe, but again, it's that question around, you've done your climate risk assessment. Are you just putting that on a spreadsheet in a folder and leave it till next year? Or are you actually taking that to your existing enterprise risk management system or your risk manager and saying, hey, you got our non-climate risks there. Can we merge this? Can we make sure that we monitor, manage this at the same time? And that's a really key component there, to make sure that all this climate work is not a separate exercise that you do once a year and that sits in a folder and you'll do it for a month and you get back to it in 11 months again. This should be ongoing and embedded and integrated. And that is that question about, like, how are you going about that? Have you already taken that step? Any further thoughts on risk management, Ilona?
Only just reiterating something you said, leverage your existing risk management framework. That is what is really being asked and expected, is how you have integrated, exactly as you said, Tim. But also in terms of assessing risk, that's a company judgment. So, and you will be asked to disclose what judgment you've applied to that. So again, using your own risk management framework to apply same sorts of judgment to your climate-related risks and opportunities.
Spot on, brilliant. And then the final component, remember the 4 TCFD pillars, metrics and targets. Now, first off then, the question here, have you considered how easy or difficult it may be to ascribe an amount or percentage of assets or business activities vulnerable to climate-related risk or aligned with opportunities? Now, that's a very long question that some people may struggle with a little bit. What are we trying to get at here? And what's the purpose of that question?
Well, it's a really key direct link between risks and opportunities and financial outcomes. And I think this is a really big call out, because it does help companies start to think about the level of detail that we are actually going here in terms of linking those risks and opportunities to direct financial outcomes. And the ask is that you quantify it wherever you can and however you can.
Yeah, great. And then on 35, we're asking consideration of how to factor climate-related considerations into executive remuneration. I think that is something we see more and more and more. So that's just, have you considered that? Have you done that? And I think a lot of people have been waiting for a long time now, thinking, we've been talking a lot about climate-related risk and opportunities. I've been doing GHG accounting. Why are you not raising that? Well, we're getting to that now. So that is a key component in metrics and targets there. So question 36 is really about, have you established a GHG accounting process? So do you know your carbon footprint? How have you done that? Where are you with that? We've provided a few options there about not starting just, done scope 1 and 2, maybe done scope 3. That's your GHG accounting. And I think the key message around that, I would say, is that sometimes organizations are the consideration that climate equals GHG. If I know my carbon footprint, I can tick the box, I'm done. Now, I think that, based on what Ilona and I have shared so far, is that there's a lot more outside of just knowing your carbon footprint. And that's really important. So we've looked at governance, at strategy, risk management, and now in that metrics and targets, we're getting to those GHG emissions. So it's a really important component, but it's not everything. So keep that in mind. The follow-up question then is, have you set any greenhouse gas emission or climate-related targets? Now, we have a little bit of a rollout there. Is the yes, then tell us, if you have that link that to mitigation, adaptation, or, science-based initiatives, and if you have any, validation by third parties on that. So that's important to know. If you are using carbon credits or offsets, again, that's more question just to understand where you are. It's not even, I don't think we even score that. It's more to understand where companies are with that. And then the final question is about understanding, have you looked around, like in terms of metrics and targets, what is your industry doing? What are your peers doing? Where are you? How are they reporting things? So really getting more of a view across the board of what's going on there. On metrics and targets, what are your key points if you want to summarize this to people? Like what's the main thing to really focus on?
I think maybe for those organizations who are not yet doing any carbon accounting, it really is time now to think about how you will embed this. I think having this additional time that organizations have had to prepare for the standards, I think really start thinking about how you're going to be measuring those, emissions, how you are going to embed this. That would just be my key call out there. Yeah.
Brilliant. Now with that, you see at the right bottom, there's a complete button. So that means we have 40 odd questions. We'll work you through. If you've answered them, complete that survey and you'll get a page like this. What that means then is we'll automatically, the moment you complete that survey, send you an email, and in that email, you'll find your readiness score with a little bit of a profile, what that means. So we've created 3 groups of where you can be in that journey, and we'll look at that in a moment. Then what we'll do is we'll actually look at what you've provided, the information. We'll prepare a more full readiness report so that has a bit more recommendation, a bit more, you can really see where have you scored high and low. What does that mean? What are some of the key components you could be focusing on to move forward and prepare? So that's the end of the survey. And from there on then, what are those 3 groups then that you can at large fall into? So we've looked at, like I said, scoring those questions there and weighing them a little bit on how important they are. And we've come up to like 3 brackets there. We have a starter group, and that means that you scored up to 60 points. And what that generally means is that you're in the early days of your climate journey. Climate-related financial reporting is either brand new or you're just exploring and taking some initial steps there. But on the whole, you haven't done a lot of work yet. So it's early days. If you look at the preparer profile, that's somewhat middle of the range. You've already taken some steps and really kind of started thinking a little bit about that climate-related financial reporting, what that could mean. You've progressed a little bit on that climate journey, but you are aware that there's still various climate-related areas that need to be addressed or improved upon. And then there's the reporter phase. That is really your seasoned climate-related financial reporter. So that means that you might have done TCFD reporting for your organization or other things that you confidently answered most of the questions. You can easily pinpoint the areas that you still need to address a little bit or improve upon, but mostly you're in pretty decent shape there to start reporting on the ASRS. That's a generic profile. So if you find yourself in one of those things, it might be that you've done a few things that, might put you, closer to the border with one of those groups. It gives you a good insight. Now, we've done that to also come up with some actions you can take. And I think that's the key here. What are some of the key actions that you can work on moving forwards to having the information and embedding some of that work in your organization? So we've listed against each group some of them here, but what we've really done is in our next section on actions, kind of outlined it a little bit more there. From that readiness assessment, we've identified a couple of key areas that you can really work on. So it could be on that value chain mapping we spoke about. It could be really getting into that climate-related financial risk and opportunity assessment. But to be able to do that, as we said, you need to know your value chain. Otherwise, it's becoming really hard to do that. Looking at more of a material topics, gap analysis on the ASRS, really focusing on that governance and strategy section. We see some companies have done their climate-related risk and opportunity. They've done a GHG accounting, but there's a lot missing in those 2 key pillars around governance and strategy. As Ilona focused on in the metrics section, GHG accounting, just getting that done and linking that then to, are you having any targets? If you are working with offsets, what's happening there? Climate scenario analysis is definitely something. Put a little bit on the right-hand side there. It is a bit more advanced. I'd say leave that to, progress a little bit in your climate journey. And then start preparing that ASRS disclosure report. So all these things are a journey towards that report there. In your first report, you might have done a few of these things, but it's really important to think your way through out of our readiness assessment. Where are you? And what are some of the actions you can take? And I think that's the key that we've kind of just gone a few minutes over time, so we'll address a few questions in a minute. But the main message we want to leave you with is do that readiness assessment. It's pretty quick. It's pretty straightforward. We'll give you some idea where you are in the journey, and then think about where you are and come back to us to talk about how it really affects your organization. So if you're not sure what it means to your organization, we're always happy, to jump on a call and talk about what you can do, which steps you can take, what moves you forward towards, finding the right solution for where you are in your climate journey. So with that, we'll jump into the Q&A in a moment. I would say if you have any questions, put them in the chat now on the right-hand side there. We have a few things that already kind of come up prior to running the webinar, that we had some questions out of the registrations there that we want to address first. But any additional questions, please put them in the chat now. The first one, Ilona, maybe you can answer that. If my business falls below the disclosure threshold, is ASRS reporting still relevant to me? And is there any value in doing that readiness assessment?
So yes, as I said sort of at the start of this webinar, there sure is, you will be impacted, and doing the readiness assessment will help you gauge some idea of how prepared you are to respond to the questions and provide the data that stakeholders in your value chain might be asking of you. So I would definitely say yes, do the readiness assessment.
I think any organization, Australian organization at least, would really get a lot of value out of knowing where they are in that journey. Second question: if I, don't have any GHG emissions, do I still need to report on the ASRS? So I think that's the question a little bit what we spoke about, but what are your views on that?
I love this question. According to Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions accounting, everybody has emissions. If you don't have if you don't have Scope 1 or 2 emissions, you will have emissions in your value chain. In other words, your Scope 3 emissions. So yes, you will still need to report on ASRS. If you do a materiality assessment and you discover that that climate change is not material for you as a business, you will still need to go through the process to provide the evidence of that. So you still need to be aware of what's going to be asked of you, and you will still need to report that that's what you found. So hopefully that answers that question.
I think on that, like I see that there's 2 questions in the chat now, but one that goes into your point you just made. Amanda asked, can you please go into materiality assessment? What is it used for and how do you start? So I think you just made a point about the materiality, the financial materiality of climate. How do you see that related to a materiality assessment?
It's in terms of a broad materiality assessment where you might consider all of the topics that exist in terms of ESG and sustainability. What we're actually doing for ASRS is honing in on climate change, that one particular topic. And we're only looking at it in terms of a risk and opportunity. So financially materiality is what we're really looking at. So we've honed in terms of what we're looking for, and but it's still applying the same question of material, which is how severe it is, how likely it is when we look at each of the risks and opportunities, and applying some prioritization, some ranking of that to determine whether it's material or not.
Excellent. I think the third question is related a little bit to Andrea's got 2 questions there as well. So I think we can take that all at once. I only need to report in a few years. So why would I worry about this now? And I think the first part of that question is, so when do companies need to start reporting? And so that Andrea asked, when is the first disclosure statement due? Now that is due on likely if the bill is adopted as is at the moment. So we're still waiting on final advice from the government there. But at the moment, as it stands, the first reporting group, which is the larger companies, they would start reporting from kind of the reporting year starts on the 1st of January 2025. So that is relatively soon. You have a little bit of time now till that date. That's the first group, but then it's kind of phased after that. So there's a second group, which is a lower threshold there, and then there's a third group, and they're all, I think, spread out by a year. So there's a little bit of time there. In terms of considering the threshold points, if we can clarify, you need to hit 2 out of 3. That's correct. Each of the 3 groups, and all this information is really kind of well put in the ASRS documentation on the AASB website as well. About the 3 groups there, what are the eligibility criteria there? And for each group, there are 3, and you need to hit 2 of them. If you have 2 of them, you're in that group, and otherwise you fall in the group under there. Should you worry about it now if you're a smaller organization that is due in 3 years? I would say yes.
Yes, absolutely. The more prepared you are, the more likely it is that you can budget more accurately. You can plan your resources more accurately. I would say there's huge, but predominantly budgetary benefits of starting to get ready now. I'm sure you can imagine that if you're leaving things to the very last minute, you will not have had that time to assess your options for carbon accounting. There are so many software providers you can shop around. It's a budget. It's a budgeting thing, I would say, is why you would worry about it right now. Yeah.
I see another question coming there from Andrea. We've just drafted disclosure in New Zealand, so I've done all this work. Can we copy and paste as such? Now, I think that's the interoperability question, to use a difficult word there, where what we're looking at around the world is a lot of jurisdictions are now doing climate-related financial reporting. They all have their slightly own flavor. A lot of them are based on TCFD, but it's always important. You probably have to reformat certain things. Each jurisdiction has their own particularities around how they want to do things, or questions they ask, or disclosure requirements. So at large, I would say copy and paste sounds a little too simple, but at large, you probably have done 80% of the work. It's putting it in the right format. There might be a few things that the Australian regime is asking that the New Zealand regime is not asking, or slightly different way. But so look at it in detail, but the majority of the work is likely done if you just report it in a different jurisdiction. Do you have any further thoughts on that, Ilona?
No, I would agree with you there. Tim. There's likely to be a substantial amount of crossover. However, there's likely to be some nuances, and that's what you're looking for. Yeah.
Exactly. Then the final question we got before, prior to the webinar, is a low readiness score bad? What does it really mean? So it's not bad. What it really shows you is where you are in your climate journey. To give it a name, is how much work have you already done? What are some of those components that you've already worked on, and how prepared are you to quite easily disclose information? So it's about organizational capacity and readiness. So the score puts you more on, where you are in that journey. And again, I think that goes back to the previous question. If you're in that starter phase, you still have a few years, ideally use that time then to progress and get ready, that in 3 years' time, when your reporting hits kind of your organization, you've taken the time and used it well. I see another question coming from Crystal. Do you have any guidance for construction companies who have to report on carbon for our projects in addition to our office operations? Is there any guidance on how to set boundary for our reporting on construction projects? I think this really goes into more GHG related questions about doing GHG accounting. I would say every industry is different, but if you have a good kind of GHG accounting support there, they can guide you through that whole process. It's really about, again, GHG accounting is about what's in your value chain there. That's like your scope 3, if your core operations, which are mostly scope 1 and 2. And if you work with someone kind of in that space that really gets how this is done, they can walk you through all that and look at project-based, look at scope 3 that sits in your supply chain there. So, for every company, it's slightly different there. So it's really important to do that well. And I would say with GHG accounting, there are definitely people that just get a spreadsheet online and try to fill it out. Sometimes it's good for your own understanding, but I would always say just, talk to the experts about it, because you might miss out on some really critical components.
Yeah. I think that comes back to the why would I worry about this now question as well, Tim, for everything that you just said there. You've got the time to actually think about these things. Yeah. And
then I think, the big question that everyone's been waiting for, where do we find this readiness assessment? It's online at socialsuitehq.com/ASRS-readiness. If you go to that link, and I'll actually put it in a chat to make your life a little bit easier. So in the chat there, you can just follow that. If you follow that link there, you get to the readiness assessment. Like I said, it's free. It will only take you 10 to 15 minutes probably to complete that. And with that, you get your readiness score. You get a full readiness report in a few days after completing that. And after doing this, if there's anything that you want to talk about in terms of what are my next steps, reach out either to myself, Ilona, book a meeting in, or my ESG director. We can really help you work out what some of the next steps could be. And we can help you with those next steps as well. So we can put you on the right pathway, and we can really help you deliver some of that work so that you are better prepared, and even help you get kind of that first ASRS disclosure report together, if that's something that you're looking toward. With that, I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I hope that was useful. I hope everyone has a bit more insight now into what the ASRS is and what that readiness assessment really can do for you in terms of determining your preparedness. Ilona, I want to thank you for helping us build that readiness assessment and explaining how it all fits together today. We'll make sure that we'll share with everyone the recording of this webinar, the slides, and we'll also send that link around to everyone. Feel free to share that link with anyone that you feel might benefit as well from the readiness assessment. I want to thank you for your time.